Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman.
This week on Heroic Media, a 29-year-old woman in Oregon defends her right to die with dignity.
A Nebraska middle school encourages teachers to drop gendered phrases.
And Heroic Media's news director, Ginny Ubing, sits down with Father Paul Check of Courage International to discuss same-sex marriage.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. Heroic Media, we discuss headlines that deal with fundamental moral issues. We tend to look at the issues of family, marriage, and life because they're so foundational for everything else in our society.
Exactly, and a lot of times those topics or stories we'll discuss will revolve around abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, homosexual marriage, those types of topics.
Exactly. So Patrick, what's our first story for today?
All right, in our first story, a recently married 29-year-old cancer patient made headlines after she scheduled her death to take place on November 1st in her bedroom in Portland, Oregon. So this is, what were your first reactions? Well, I guess let's give a little bit of background, right?
Sure.
So this 29-year-old woman, she was recently married, and she started having like really bad headaches and stuff. Long story short, she was diagnosed with brain cancer. She had a surgery. It didn't completely get rid of it, sounds like. It got worse, and her life expectancy went from years to a matter of months, like 6 months. And so because of this, she decided, well, I'm going to die anyway. There's no cure for it. So I'm just going to end my life on my own terms, basically. And so she chose a specific date. She wanted to be in her room with her family and friends. And Oregon is like one of 5 states, I think, in the U.S. that allows you to, assisted suicide or whatever you want to call it. Death with dignity is what it's called. So, so she decided that she wants to take her own life. And so she has a prescription for a drug that she'll take, and then it'll kill her.
Right, right.
So.
I think, honestly, this story, when I first read it, was heartbreaking. I mean,
Yeah.
I felt sick. It was so sad to see this, and just to see the emptiness and the desperation that's driving her to do this. And she clearly thinks this is a good thing. She wants to spend her time advocating to make this easier to do.
Right.
So she lived in California, and that is not a state where you're allowed to kill yourself with drugs. And so she moved to Oregon. She and her husband, she had to get a new residence, new driver's license. Her husband had to take a leave of absence from work. And so her argument is that it's too difficult to do this, and they want to make it easier. And so she's really trying to use her time on Earth to make it easier to kill yourself. And I just thought that was so heartbreaking, because I've seen, in contrast, so many stories of hope and just of a truly dignified death in which you accept death without trying to cause it.
Right, yeah, and I think that's the key, accepting it without causing it, because she's definitely causing it. And like you said, in these situations, there's not, you've seen other situations, right, where there is great hope. And in this one, that was my initial reaction too. There's like a 6.5-minute video by Compassion and Choices is what the company's called, and she's featured in this. And she just explains basically why she wants to take her own life. Right. And she doesn't view it as suicide. She views it as, well, I'm already going to be dying anyway because of this disease, this cancer in my brain. And I just want to have more control over the situation and know the exact, I want this on my terms, basically, is what she said. And my whole thing was, like, basically, I mean, I have a lot of different things I could talk about. But one of the things that struck me the most right off the bat was this whole dignity talk. And like, what exactly does that mean? And words are so hard to decipher, right? Like, different meanings and words kind of, with time, seem to change sometimes too. And as far as I could tell, this right with dignity just meant that, like, she wanted to, from her description of why she was doing this, is if she died in a lot of pain in a lot of anguish, or not maybe looking or acting like she's looking and acting right now in a more healthy state, that would not be dignity. And so one of the things that jumped out was, well, what does that say to people who do die in suffering, right? Who maybe don't have access to just take a pill and kill yourself, or they don't have access to medical care. What does that say about them?
Exactly. And
right?
I think John Paul II is such a huge example of this, the way that he really suffered in the last years of his life.
Yeah.
And that is an example of dignity. And I don't want to undermine the suffering that that would be in her future. And it really is very, very painful. But the thing is, the church and Christ doesn't promise us an avoidance of suffering. What he promises us is that at the deepest, darkest moments of our suffering, he'll be there with us. Christ died an incredibly painful death. He suffered. He was tortured to death. And he did that so that he could experience it with us, and so that our suffering can become redemptive. So the goal should not be to escape from suffering, but to unite it with Christ. And it's hard, but we can find meaning in it. And that's something that she's not going to have. She's taking her own life. She's removing that meaning.
Exactly. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think as Christians, that's the biggest thing that we can take out of this, right? Because of course, we don't want to willingly seek out suffering or anything like that. But when we do have when we have suffering put on us, we need to embrace that however we can. It's not to say she couldn't take pain medication or anything like that to relieve suffering, but it's an opportunity to offer that up, right? Christ gave us the ultimate picture of what it means to suffer, and he gave meaning to suffering, right? And so we're supposed to imitate that, and we're supposed to offer that up. So I think what you said.
One other note that I want to mention really quick, I saw this really interesting contrast, as I mentioned, some contrast. There's a seminarian in North Carolina. His name is Philip Johnson. He was also, as a young man, diagnosed with brain cancer in his 20s. He was told that he wasn't going to live very long. He's still alive 6 years later, which brings up another point. What if medicine progresses to the point that in a few years they are able to cure what she has?
What if they find the cure using her or something like that, right?
Exactly.
I mean, who knows?
But this seminarian was, this young man was told that he was going to die, and so he said, I'm going to use the time that I have left on this earth to serve other people. So he became a seminarian. He wants to become a priest, and he's just going out and serving people. And he said that his pain and his suffering has taught him how to be empathetic towards others and allowed him to serve others. So what a sharp contrast in using that pain and suffering and turning it into something positive.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Great point.
In our next story, a Nebraska middle school is coming under fire for instructing its teachers to avoid words like boys and girls and instead to use gender-inclusive phrases.
Right, like purple penguin.
Purple penguins.
Yeah, I thought that story, when I first heard that, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Some of the stuff that people come up with where they think, first of all, it's just, it seems like these suggestions, right, which were given to this school because there was a student who was, conflicted with this, or trying to figure out what to do. The teacher didn't want this student to feel left out or feel like, oh my gosh, okay, boys in this line, girls in this line, which line do I get in? Or they get in the line that they identify with, and they go, no, you definitely look like a girl, right? So I mean, this is obviously, you can tell, especially for little kids that might be going through this. It is troubling, right? And so, but I think the response to it is a little kind of crazy, right? Coming up with this, instead of saying, hey boys and girls, or hey guys, let's call them purple penguins type. It's like, really?
It's so strange. Honestly, I'm not surprised that a guide like this exists. It's called 12 Steps on the Way to Gender Inclusiveness. And it's created by a group that's rather radical and is definitely pushing an agenda. I think the surprising thing is that a school would actually implement this or give this to their teachers and say, here's a good example for you. And you just look at some of these things. They're trying to avoid gendered expressions like boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. So they say, come up with fun alternatives like purple penguins, or divide people up by other attributes, kids who like skateboards versus kids who like bikes. And then ask kids what pronoun they want to be referred to as he or she. And they also recommend decorating your classroom with a sign that says all genders welcome. So I mean, really, it's promoting. I thought it was very telling. You're saying, well, what are they doing? Are they just trying to be compassionate? What's the goal here? I thought the agenda was really revealed in one statement that was in this document. Avoid using normal to define any behaviors. That's the bottom line. That's the goal. Is we don't want anything to be normal. Everything is just subjective and everything is relative. And if you feel like it, okay, and if I feel tomorrow, if I wake up and I feel like I'm a duck, who are you to say that that's not normal? We can't, I mean, you just look at it, it's so absurd. There are things that are normal and there are things that are not normal.
Absolutely. And I think that it's just you're denying an obvious truth, right? And instead of that whole write-up that was given out, the information that was given to those students at that school and parents and whoever it was given to. It was just, it seemed like it just was focused on dodging the questions, right? Like, and I think that our society today always does that, right? They don't want to get down to the nitty gritty and talk about things, right? They just want to say, okay, we just want to make everybody feel okay. So like, you know, it's kind of like this PC type thing gone crazy, right? And so you're right, though. It does just morph and it continue to degrade and expand into other areas, right? Like the whole idea of that there are absolute truths and things like that, right? Like your sex that you were born with. And so I think instead of attacking it head on, they just, they come up with these other things to kind of work around it so that it's not so awkward. But I mean, I don't have the answer, but I mean, for my kids, I think you just have to be open and honest and talk about the differences and what people are going through.
Yeah. I mean, it's very simple. A boy is a male child.
Right.
A girl is a female child. It's not, you know, it's not discriminatory. That's the sex. That's the reality.
Yeah, and God created us male and female, right? It's not discriminatory. It kind of taps into religious sides of things when you get to where calling someone a male or a female is discriminatory, right? It's really interesting state that we're in these days. So.
Absolutely. Coming up after the break, an interview with the head of a ministry for same-sex attracted individuals.
Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. Between the Synod of Bishops and the Supreme Court, homosexual marriage has dominated headlines recently. Heroic Media's news director Jenny Eubing had the opportunity to sit down and talk to Father Paul Czech, the executive director of Courage International, a ministry that reaches out to Catholics with same-sex attraction to help them live out their faith. Let's take a look at that video.
Father Czech, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Jenny, thank you for the invitation.
It's a pleasure to have you. I wanted to start out asking you about the recent decision by the Supreme Court to decline to hear a case which could have paved the way for either nationwide legalization of or a ban on so-called same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
And what are really the implications of that for persons who are struggling with same-sex attraction, trying to live faithfully the Church's teachings, and finding themselves in a culture that is just increasingly more accepting of and even celebrating the idea of homosexual marriage?
Well, a good question. I think it's clear that the decision, or the non-decision in a way, was a disappointment, but consistent with the direction the culture has been moving for many years. 50 years ago, culturally, we decided that sex and babies could be separated. And from that moment on, it became clear that the direction would find itself where we are right now, as the great gift of fertility is not something that is approached with reverence and protected within the covenant of marriage. I think for the people that Courage represents and who are members of our apostolate, this is a sadness, because we all need the helps that come from the community to include the culture, not just the church, to strive for virtue. And when the voices around us, civilly, culturally, are suggesting that we should live in one way, and we're struggling to live in another way, that can be a source of tension and real difficulty. So for our people, a disappointment, but predictable, and so they will rely more and more on God's grace to continue to persevere, and I'm sure they will.
Yeah, interesting. The point you made about the separation of sex and babies is such an important thing to keep in mind.
Yes.
Because a lot of what drives the enthusiasm of the homosexual movement is this idea that, well, if we're telling some people that it's fine to have sex divorced from procreation,
yes,
then how can we tell other people, no, you're not allowed?
The point, again, very well made. For our consistency, for our integrity, it's important that we preach the fullness of the virtue of chastity, which excludes the use of contraception within marriage. Once we grant that that's a possibility, then yes, it's understandable why two people would say, well, it seems to be okay over here, a man and a woman within a marriage that the church would recognize. Why is it not then okay for us, according to the way that we understand our partnership? It deliberately excludes fertility in babies, therefore we should be able to live this way. So that there is a foundational problem there with regard to contraception. And again, for the integrity of the church, the visible church or the institutional church, this is something that we have to preach and help people understand, because it's only through that chaste marital love that there will be proper fulfillment, true fulfillment, not just gratification and satisfaction in marriage.
Great. And I want you now to talk a little bit about the model of courage. I know that you have a film forthcoming.
Yes.
That you were hoping to discuss today.
Sure.
So give us a picture of what it looks like, what your ministry is.
Well, so back in 1980, the servant of God, Terence Cardinal Cook, realized that there's an underserved population that has every bit of the claim on the heart of Christ as everyone else. But it would appear as though all that the church was offering to them is the word no. You can't do something. You can't behave in a certain way. To correct that, he began the Courage Apostolate, which is the church's pastoral charity, her understanding of the human condition that sometimes means that people are attracted erotically to members of the same sex. But looking beneath that to the true dignity that is there. One of the reasons why in Courage we don't use the terms homosexual or lesbian or gay is that it seems unjust to collapse someone's identity into their sexual preference or appetite. And they're much richer than that. So Cardinal Cook set about beginning a support group whereby men and women with, we say same-sex attractions, the homosexual inclination, could find the encouragement that they need within the church to live a life of chastity and to have that confidence that they are in the heart of Christ. Father Harvey was the first executive director. He was an oblate of St. Francis de Sales. And I remember when I first began working in the apostolate 10 years ago, he told me, our best ambassadors are our members. They are the ones who put the face on the question of homosexuality. For many, the church's teaching can seem sterile and aloof. But when we put a face on the question, when we have someone who has the homosexual inclination, who has trusted that what the church teaches is true and leads to fulfillment, now we have something that is very attractive in the world that wants to hear stories and narratives. So we've made a movie. 3 of our members very generously, very humbly, very courageously agreed to tell their stories on camera. The film is called The Desire of the Everlasting Hills. The title comes from the litany of the Sacred Heart. It's one of the invocations, O Jesus, desire of the everlasting hills, have mercy on us, and expresses the desire of the human heart for fulfillment in Christ. So that movie is available online, free of charge. Anyone can watch it at the website everlastinghills.org. And it puts a face to the struggle, but also to the joy that comes from living in the heart of Christ and in the heart of the church.
Beautiful. And so often there is this misconception for Christians, for Catholics who are struggling with the same-sex attraction, that there's no room for me in the church,
Yes.
or I'm rejected, I'm not welcome here.
I think if anyone had that sense and they attended our annual national conference in the United States and spent 30 minutes amongst the group of people who are there, we often have as many as 350, they would find something else to be the case. Here are people who have a strong conviction that they are fully loved by Christ, fully embraced by the church. They have a particular aspect of their life that they contend with, but they do so with that sense of trust and perseverance, and they do it together in a way that, for me, as a priest, is very edifying.
Fantastic. And how can we, as the average Catholic in the pew, how can we be more welcoming and more joyful in an invitation to people who are struggling in this way?
I think first is to learn a little bit more about homosexuality as the church teaches. So to go to our website would be a good place to start. Courage RC for Roman Catholic, couragerc.net or .org both.
Okay.
And to look there, because there's a lot of information, the stories, the narratives, information that helps us to see how chastity is truly part of the good news and not just a restraint on something. This would be a good way for people to begin. Some true and authentic understanding about what the church teaches and why.
Fantastic. And that's couragerc.net or couragerc.org.
.org, either one. And the film is everlastinghills.org.
Okay. Thank you so much, Father Chuck, for being with us today.
Jenny,
and
thank you.
God bless courage. God bless the work you're doing.
Thank you, and for your prayers.
Oh, that was some good stuff. I really like their conversation. I think one of the things that really stood out to me the most was just the whole idea or the topic of the fullness of truth, especially when it comes to divorcing sex and babies from sex, right? And specifically contraception in marriage, especially, right? Because when we don't teach the fullness of the truth, then things kind of get to the point where we allow the idea of same-sex marriage to be, well, I mean, if you can divorce babies, you know, from a heterosexual marriage, then what about this union that we call marriage, you know, between two men or two women?
Right. It's just, it was leading to it, is setting it up.
It leads right to it, exactly.
Absolutely. Coming up after the break, we will have one more story.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to Heroic Media. For our final story, Dr. Edward Green, a Harvard HIV expert, has been taking heat from his colleagues recently after he revealed that he agrees with what Pope Benedict had to say about condom use in Africa. So I thought that was pretty interesting, right?
Very
These
interesting.
science types usually, I mean, at least what the media portrays, they don't generally agree with what a religious figure like the Pope has to say about these things, right? They usually say, yes, condom use is the way to go to stop the spread of AIDS and HIV in these areas, right? But it was really enlightening because all the research and the studies and everything, his body of experience basically showed him, the facts were there, that in these locations where they were using condoms, there was not a drop. But he noticed that in I think it was like 5 or 6, or it was 8 or 9 countries in Africa that did show a decrease in HIV, the commonality between them was basically what Pope Benedict XVI was preaching, which was we need to have monogamous relationships. Right,
exactly.
Not give everybody condoms and have, you know, multiple sexual partners. And so that was really interesting that the data showed that.
Right, absolutely. And so, you know, this was a few years ago. Pope Benedict made these statements, but he basically said that giving out condoms is not helping the situation, and it might actually be harming the situation.
Right.
Controversial statement. And then this Dr. Edward Green, he's the director of Harvard's HIV Prevention Research Project, and he really is at the forefront of this field because he started studying HIV before AIDS even became a really big epidemic.
Exactly.
He was there, you know, for years. And what he said, you know, he said, looking at it from a public health standpoint, we have not seen that condoms have worked at the population or national levels in Africa. And what he said was, instead of seeing condom availability associated with lower HIV infection rates, it's actually associated with higher HIV infection rates. Very interesting.
And the reason for that, there's an interview out there that you can go check out if you want to see the whole entire contents. And he certainly isn't he's not Catholic, and he certainly doesn't agree with the Pope on other things, but he definitely said, hey, you know, I agree with him on this thing, and my scientific findings support what he's saying. But yeah, the reason for what was basically discovered was that when there's a lot of condom use, people will get the idea. First of all, they don't use them properly a lot of times, right? He said something like 5%. It was abysmally low. I was like, wow, I didn't realize it was that bad. And then also the protection rate was one of the things that stood out in his conversation was that it was like 85% on the high end is what I saw, and I was like, wow. I mean, if I was like worried about getting AIDS, I would want it to be 100%, right? Not 85%. I wouldn't want any risk.
Exactly.
But the people, basically, they have a false sense of security almost.
Right.
So combine the false sense of security with, you know, low rates of using condoms properly, along with it's not 100% effective. People start to feel like, oh, I can go out and you know, maybe try more risky sexual things, more partners, like, I don't know, all the different things, but basically it opened things up to increase the chances of spreading.
Exactly, and so the specific study in Uganda had 2 groups of young people, one where condoms were being provided free and available, and the other where they weren't, and they found that the group that had the more available condoms had more sexual partners than the other group, and the number of sexual partners increased when they were given the condoms. So they're given this false sense of security. They're being told, hey, AIDS is out there, but here, this will protect you. Whereas the other people are saying, okay, AIDS is a reality, so I'm not going to take that risky behavior.
Right.
And of course, like you mentioned, he says that it's only 80 to 85% successful when used properly, but probably no more than 5% of any large national population is using condoms consistently.
Right.
So isn't this the same argument that's used against abstinence education?
Right.
Well, it's effective, but we can't expect people to use it properly.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it, and that's what. And it's funny because he felt like he needed to kind of stick his neck out and put his reputation on the line, because this is what the truth is about the situation from a scientific perspective, not no religion involved. And I mean, I'm glad that he came out and said this, because when the facts support something like this, it just makes sense, right? And people, it's kind of, he made a comparison, I think it was to sunscreen, right? People go, oh, well, if I put sunscreen on, then I'm protected from the sun, therefore I can stay out in the sun longer. But really, you get more exposure to having harmful rays, penetrate your skin, and then you get skin cancer, right? You're more likely to. So it's the same thing with sex and condoms. And he recommends an ABC strategy: abstain, be faithful, use a condom, in that order. So I thought that was nice coming from someone who's maybe a non-religious background, right? Abstain from sex, and then if you are not going to, be faithful, right? In a monogamous relationship with one person, your wife or your husband, right? So I thought in the end, it was good advice. I'm glad he stuck his neck out there, but his colleagues were saying, oh no, we need to use condoms more and just train people better, but it shows that it doesn't work. All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please check out our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can read more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's it for this time. Until next week, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.